Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back to the World Complexity Science Academy podcast. This week for the series, we're going to be doing a masterclass with none other than the president, Professor Andreas PItasi himself, professor out of Italy, author. I believe his most recent work may have been The Evolution of Knowledge. He's going to be talking to us today about a lot of things. We got hyper-citizenship, hyper-cities, and complexity science itself. But before we get into that, I do always want to plug WCSA global.org. That's WCSAglobal.org. Check us out if you're interested in what we talk about. It's a pleasure to have you here, Dr. PItasi. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and let you take it away.
Yes, as the president of WCSA, I'm very honored and delighted to give this masterclass today. And I will I will facilitate my presentation through a quick PowerPoint to make your understanding of some not common sense concepts easier. The first slide is the title, Hyper-Citizens and their Hyper-Cities. I'll explain it a bit later. As I told you, I'm the president of World Complexity Science Academy. And it is easy to explain what it is. It is a think tank. It is a think tank focused on the strategic use of the complex system approach to global governance and policy modeling for public policies. So basically, we use the complex system approach to deal with the very fundamental challenges on the global scale, which are essentially faced by disciplines like social sciences, political sciences, law, and economics. Of course, the complex system has a wider tradition also in physics, also in biology, but I will not dig in this part of the discipline today, otherwise it would be very time-consuming and not so focused in my presentation. So, WCSA is a think tank, and as a think tank, it is working on, as I said, it is working on the strategic complex system approach focused on public policies and policy modeling from the perspective of global governance.
Yes.
So the most important challenges of our times, which are macro challenges, like in the field of ecology, like in the field of energy, like in the field of health, like recently clarified also by the COVID pandemic we are living through. Many challenges are becoming much global, and the local solutions don't work anymore. Don't work anymore to solve this problem. But before we try to solve the problems, we need a very important evolution in problem setting. The way we cope with the questions is also the way it leads us to the answers. So the way we shape the questions is the way we also, in a certain way, anticipate the answers we will generate. That is why the complex system approach is very much focused on defining complex systems, which are those systems which require a very accurate selection and organization of interconnections to create meaning. It is very simplistic today to say that we are overwhelmed by information, by exceeding information. And probably it's not much information. Nowadays it's becoming noise because we are overwhelmed by plenty of information which we are no longer able to select, to understand as quickly as we should. And then it becomes noise. And sometimes we need very accurate procedures, mechanisms, and techniques to understand how to select what is relevant. A bit like when the old guys in Klondike went to search for gold, and they need the tool to make a distinction between gold and mud. And sometimes the gold was hidden, was concealed in the mud, so it was not that easy. So sometimes we need to reframe the concepts through which we describe what we observe. In the complex system theory, we know that we don't observe facts directly, we don't observe things. We, in a certain way, observe the distinction between ourselves and our observation. I'll give you an example. A person who lives in New York maybe doesn't even know New York in every part of the city. That person ignores many streets, ignores many corners, ignores many places and buildings. In his or her brain, there is a his or her New York, the places where that person goes for shopping, the places where that person goes for a coffee with the friends. So there is a kind of a cognitive, symbolic New York, which is different for almost everybody living in New York.
Right.
The same for Vienna, the same for Paris. And sometimes, for example, we go for a walk, and for many reasons, a store which was there for decades, a store closed because the owner sold the activity, because for many reasons. And probably just a few days later, we didn't notice that the store was closed, and we didn't remember what the store was about before, what was it selling. Because maybe for us it was not so important, it was not familiar to us, although it was on the way to our, for example, walking path from our place to our office.
Right.
So cities like towns and like metropolitan areas are much more cognitive maps and mental maps and symbolic systems.
Absolutely.
Before than physical environments. Yes, of course. I can tell you a joke, but somebody would tell me it's a racist joke, but I'm not a racist, and I am Italian, so I can tell jokes about Italians. We Italians are so lazy that we say never go to work before 8 a.m. because the streets outdoor are not ready yet.
Yeah.
As if every night the streets go out, go away, go to sleep, and then they wake up slowly, then they start to be active again when you wake up. So you have to wake up a little after the streets are ready, otherwise you will find nothing.
I love that.
It's just an idiomatic expression, of course, and it's not true, but in a certain way, of course, the city at 5 o'clock in the morning is not the city at 9 o'clock in the morning.
Very true. You know, before you,
yes.
sorry, before you continue, I wanted to ask you a few questions. Like, a few people have asked me about this. In your opinion, what makes the World Complexity Science Academy unique?
It's a good question. I think there are many important and high-quality networks, associations, and societies which study complex systems. Of course, we have some interests in common, and also we are proudly members of the International Federation of Systemic Research. So on one side, the WCSA is deeper and deeper interconnected in an even larger network, because, of course, on one side, nobody can stand alone. On the other side, of course, we are not just one of the piece like any other. We have our specific contribution, and our specific contribution is twofold. On one side, we work basically on the most advanced frontiers of complex system theory from the original general theorization of Niklas Luhmann and other scholars. And so for people who work in systems, to clarify that we mostly work starting from Luhmann's works means a lot. At this stage, in such a presentation, Luhmann can be just a keyword for further research.
Yeah.
Because if I start explaining Luhmann's theory, it will become another presentation and maybe another video. The other, as I told you, it's a twofold matter. The other point is that WCSA is trying to provide a scientific observation of how we model our society and how we frame the exchanges, the challenges. On the other side, we are aware that theory and practice are deeply interconnected at the level of strategic application. What I mean is that, of course, the way you talk about cities, towns, and hypercities, as we'll tell you later, is very much focused on the symbolic meaning of the city, for example. And the people from WCSA probably, I cannot tell you about everybody because I don't know all the members, of course. But in general, in terms of mission, vision, and scope, WCSA tries to let this model become true. So the way you observe is the way you model. While you are observing, you are also some way modeling. When you make a survey about, for example, I will not talk politics, don't worry. If you make a survey about Trump versus Biden for the White House, whatever the survey says, it is not just a description or a foresight. In a certain way, if it goes to the media, it becomes a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy which gives more influence to one of the candidates according to the results of the survey itself. So science can be impartial, can be elegant, conceptually speaking, but it's very hard to believe in a very neutral idea of science. Because also science generates meaning, and every time you create meaning, also through a survey, and you share the information about the survey, you are influencing someone else according to his or her needs, attitudes, fears, hopes, and whatever. And so probably the survey tells you something which is meaningless in say, and is much more meaningful according to the cognitive and perceptive filters of the person.
Absolutely.
Those cognitive and perceptive filters make that person what Luhmann would have called a psychic self-referential system. So we don't get what is out there. We get what we understand could be meaningful, joyful or painful or scaring for us, but is meaningful for our construction, cognition, and perception. And the same is for hypercitizenship. And hypercities are, metaphorically speaking, contexts. I don't like environments because it's a tricky word with too many meanings. I prefer context from this point of view.
Hi.
But whose meaning is very much depending on the city modeling. on social construction. For example, if you go to with the past, with the memory, I'm older than you, but if you go to the Italy, to the Bologna, my hometown, or Milan or Rome, maybe of the 70s of the last century or the 80s of the last century, all stores were closed for lunchtime, for what the Spanish friends call the siesta.
Yeah.
So they opened from 8 o'clock in the morning usually up to 12:30 p.m. Then they reopened at 4 p.m., closing again around 7:30. Today's lifestyle would not allow this because people are often at work during lunchtime, and probably they have more time for shopping after they end their office service. So stores are opening maybe a bit later in the morning, but are closing maybe at 10 p.m., 11 p.m., midnight, or even later. And also about tourism. Italy, is much focused on tourism, but it's a metaphor. If you are a Dutch person and you are a tourist in Italy and you want to have dinner, it means 5 o'clock for you, 5 o'clock p.m. And you get crazy if you find out that their dinner means 9 p.m. or 10 p.m.
Yeah.
So if you have a Dutch, Belgian, French, Americans, Canadians, Africans, Germans, Austrians, Italians living in the same city, in what we will call a cosmopolitan hyper-citizen, of course you have a great hyper-city. You need a very multicultural, cosmopolitan, and highly organized, non-stop organization.
Absolutely.
In a certain way, the hypercity never sleeps. Of course, when we think about hypercities, on one side we can think about New York, Vienna, Lisbon, Amsterdam, Brussels, Toronto, but hypercity is something more than a big city in a metropolitan area with a much melting pot, more or less successful melting pot. Well, say it's a bit more. Otherwise, I would have adopted the term big city and not hypercity. So some things are in common, some things are specific. I wish I am clear for the moment.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay, just a little fight with my slides. I don't understand why. It doesn't let me go to the next slide. That's curious. Yes, hyper-citizenship, because my research begins with a systemic approach to hyper-citizenship, and hyper-cities were a kind of specific applied case. My research began to be focused, of course, from a complex system approach. About the policy modeling of citizenship in its evolutionary term now in this fast-changing world. If you take a look, we are talking about common sense at the moment. You can see that, for example, many criticism about globalization are about a misunderstood loss of identity. But it is impossible to have a loss of identity Because if you are a complex system scholar, you know that identity doesn't exist. So it is very clear that if we talk about citizenship in legal terms, we are talking about some legal jurisdictions about the delivery of a passport. And at this stage, we can accept that. This delivery of the passport can be based on different principles. And as these principles are very old, some of them are still labeled in Latin, which is totally stupid because no Latins are alive anymore. No people who speak Latin. Yes, they say Italians, Portuguese, Brazilians, Argentinians, Spanish, they are all Latins. I think Julius Caesar would not agree about that.
Yeah.
Okay. Hmm? So identity doesn't exist. What do I mean? Imagine you go to Vienna and they offer you a nice piece of Zaccatorte, their typical, what they call their typical cake. Okay? Which is made basically of chocolate and apricot jam. I don't remember this huge amount of apricots in the fields of Austria, actually. Hmm? And if you go back to the past through the different ages, you understand that chocolate is something which has something to do with cocoa. Cocoa is something to do with what now we call the Americas. The Americas because of Amerigo Vespucci, who was a guy from Florence who tried to make money and power crossing the oceans to get new resources. So a guy from Florence gave the name to America. At the same time, Christopher Columbus was not smart enough to understand that those were Americas. He thought it was the Indias. And that is why now he just has a small country named Colombia in his name. So there is Colombia, there are the Americas, or Italians, but Columbus was a guy from Genoa, what now we call Italy, but he was totally misunderstood and totally delegitimated by the local power of the Republic of Genoa. And so he went to Portugal to make the proposal to go to the India westwards. And they said, "You're stupid, no thanks." And then he went to Spain. And Isabel of Castilla said that it was a stupid idea, but it was a very cheap one. So in case it was unsuccessful, the problem for the crown of Spain was very little. In case Columbus was successful, it was a great result for the Spanish crown. So let's give him 3 ships and then let's see what he does. And the guy was successful. He went to the Americas, thinking it was not in America but India. Then he found out cocoa. But cocoa was spicy at those times. It was not sweet. He sent back some cocoa roots with the ships back to the Queen of Spain. She didn't like that, too spicy. And then the master chefs of those times, in terms of pastries and sweet food, worked that cocoa out. The first ones were the Dutch and then the Bavarians, to turn it into sweet. That way, you arrive to what we call cocoa now, which is the basic ingredient of Zuckertorte.
Yeah.
So to have the typical Austrian cake, you need the Native Americans, you need a guy from Genoa under a Spanish flag, you need the Dutch specialist in sweet, a Bavarian specialist in sweet, again the Queen of Spain, who appreciated the new version of the cocoa, and then it is hard to believe Zuckertorte is typical. Is typical Austrian, just like the typical Mediterranean food, spaghetti al pomodoro. Spaghetti are a Chinese invention, and then tomato came from, once again, the same ships coming from the Americas with the cocoa. So the more you try to make it a neat distinction, this is typical from here, this is typical of this identity, the more you understand that everything is interconnected with everything since a long, 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 long time.
Absolutely.
Cake
as a complex system.
Absolutely. It's let's say that cake is not a fully complex system because the cake is not autopoietic. So a cook which makes another cake is required. A cake doesn't generate another cake, but it would be fantastic if a cake could generate another cake. It would be wonderful.
Yeah.
So, in brief, if we speak about citizenship in the old way of legal terms, we speak about the delivery of a passport.
Yeah.
This passport is not an identity, or rather, it is a legal identity. But it's not a real identity. My passport is Italian, but I drink only decaf coffee.
No espresso.
No espresso, and I don't drink wine at all. And sometimes I drink not alcoholic beer. So it would be enough to let the Italian government to cancel my Italian passport.
That's what absolutely. I feel like they might cancel that if that's what you propose as an Italian. That would never fly.
So it is important to make a distinction between the legal shape of identity, citizenship, and the passport, and the other components which shape what is called identity, which is usually a temporary shape.
Absolutely.
Of something which is evolving. There are many authors. I like to remember Elias Canetti. His childhood was in German. He was speaking German when he was a child, but when he was a teenager, if I remember well, his language became Spanish, and moreover, he met some uncles and aunts from Turkey. And Canetti lived almost 90 years, if I remember well, and they changed so many places, so many languages, so many identities, that at the very end, how can I say? At the very end, it was many different identities in one biography. There is a fantastic story he told about himself. When he lived in London during the Second World War, he went to a party, and the party was given by his neighbor who wanted to welcome him in the neighborhood because Canetti just arrived from Austria, I think, or the Netherlands. I don't remember now, sorry. And he had just published a book a novel whose original title is Auto da Fe, self-burning. It's a long story about a professor, his library, but we don't care about the novel. The funny story is that during this party, there were some men with their drinks, their coffees, their whiskey or whatever, or white wine, talking about his novel. He came next to this small crowd in the party, and he began to listen. And then the leader of the group, at a certain point, told him, "Okay, you just joined us. You were listening. What is your opinion about that novel? Do you know the novel?" And they said, "Yes, I like the novel, and I think its basic idea is this, this, and this." And the gentleman replied to him, "Oh, actually, I don't agree. I disagree. You didn't get the point of the author." But Canetti was the author. And they didn't realize that they were talking with the author who was telling them the key concept of his own novel.
Yeah.
So the answer was you didn't understand the novel because they didn't realize that he was the author.
Yeah.
So what is identity?
Got me. You got me.
Yeah. That is why I think it's very different to talk about hyper citizenship and global citizenship. Because global citizenship would mean that with just one passport, we could travel across a world where we need to be formally identified. But in practice, we move across the planet with no borders and no customs. That's global citizenship. Okay? And then we have just, I use the term passport because in a certain way, we have to be certified as ourselves, for example, according to our fingerprint. That's me. Okay. So you can use biological information to code that person like that person, but that person is just a biological code with no identity. So global citizenship is this stuff, is the freedom to go across the planet with no borders, no customs, at the same time being, in a certain way, traced. Because if you kill someone, the problem is not at the customs or at the border, but if you kill someone, they must be able to understand that you were the killer because they found your DNA on the crime scene. But it is you because the DNA on the crime scene and your DNA match. But your name could be John, Juan, Pablo, Heinrich, Giovanni. It will not change. So this is global citizenship. Hyper citizenship is the challenge that you have to, in a certain way, consider evolution of personality, evolution of social systems, evolution of politics, of economics, of legal shapes and legal orders, like continuous recombinations of what we can call meanings, symbols, just like in the case of the Austrian cake, which is not so Austrian. Indeed, a great cake, but not much Austrian. So the distinction between global citizenship and hyper citizenship is very important to understand because it is an evolutionary step towards a more aware and a more comprehensive conception of how the world around you is modeled. If you are born in New York, just to come back to the first example we gave, you are experiencing one of the best architectural urban solutions of the Dutch. not of the British. If you take a look at New York and Amsterdam and the way in the 13th century Amsterdam was nothing, it didn't even exist. The Eastern Roman Empire was falling down after centuries and centuries, and Amsterdam didn't even exist yet. In just 6-7 centuries, Amsterdam became a very important trade city and also academic city. And in general, through diamonds, through different business, became a very important city worldwide, inspiring many different other cities. But Amsterdam was shaped in the middle of nothing, stealing land from the waters. Technologically, for the 13th century, Amsterdam could not even exist. So it was a kind of great strategic problem solving of the Dutch, which in a certain way were able to duplicate it more or less in New York. So the basic structure of the city of New York, I try to go faster now, and also skipping some slides to be more effective. So hyper citizenship in terms of legal shape of citizenship is basically what shapes a formal profile into a passport. Citizenship in terms of evolution of identity in a complex world, in a complex global scenario like ours, turns into hyper-citizenship. Because 4 features are required to this kind of evolutionary, both psychic and social systems. The feature of cosmopolitanism, and I already gave the example of the cocoa, so I will not repeat myself. The matter that a citizen now must be much more science and knowledge intensive than the past generations. When we talk about COVID or energy or nuclear energy or ecology, we cannot think only in terms of left and right, liberal or conservative. We needed to have some scientific knowledge, some deep and reliable knowledge, even if professionally we are not scientists. So it is one of the first ages in which the citizen is required to be highly educated, not only in terms of degrees, but also in terms of continuous selection of information through reliable knowledge. Information is something which is meaningless if you don't have the filters, the tools, and the methods to select that. That is why in the complex system theory, normally the big distinction is not between knowledge and information, but it's between knowledge and noise, or if you prefer, meaning and noise.
You just got me thinking to the election that's about to happen in the United States, and we've just got so much noise,
Absolutely.
and a lot of people are having trouble really figuring out what's noise and what's real.
Exactly. Also, the conspiracy theories are emerging everywhere, which are a kind of coherent, consistent, and very often false, not reliable visions.
Absolutely.
But they are sold in a sort of religious market of beliefs. So you can believe that aliens are behind the spread of COVID on the planet,
That's a new one.
or whatever. No,
I've never heard that aliens were responsible for
there is also
coronavirus.
this version about the reptilians. It's an old story.
Yeah. I
But,
know about that.
well,
Yes.
but so what I mean is that in our age we need what in hyper citizenship is called the scientific citizenship dimension. So citizens must be educated not only in terms of degrees, because a person could have 10 degrees and being stupid anyway. Okay, a degree is not a degree is a good start, but a degree is not a guarantee alone. At the same time, you need to have great knowledge, reliable tools to filter information through knowledge, to make the distinction between noise and meaning. Sometimes it is because people are ignorant, sometimes because some people want other in the field of the stock exchange. Some articles in the newspapers often talk about the crash of that company, which hasn't crashed yet. People get scared, they panic selling, and the same people who supported the writing of the article bought at very cheap prices the stocks. And then the stocks climb up again. This is one more example of construction,
Okay.
If you ask what is the reality of the financial market, every expert of finance would laugh at you. The reality of what? We are just shaping knowledge, meaning, noise, meaning, noise. And if you don't understand how to separate noise from meaning, you will panic selling and you will lose your money, and I will buy your stock options or your stocks.
Aye.
The third approach, the third dimension of hyper citizenship is what I call entrepreneurial. Not everybody is gifted to become an entrepreneur. So in this case, I don't mean entrepreneurial citizenship radically, because of course there are public servants, there are employees of the companies. Not everybody is an entrepreneur in the specific meaning of the word. But at the same time, as we are in an ever-changing and fast-changing world, if we stuck in a very rigid perception of ourselves in terms of identity, of habits, of social world, of job, probably we could not realize that if we don't change our working style or our profession or our neighborhood or the city where we live, we could become obsolete in a short time. And so entrepreneurial, not in the meaning to become a professional entrepreneur. It's not for everybody. I don't think that you wake up one morning and you become Bill Gates. Not that easy. Okay. But at the same time, you cannot wake up a morning and expect the next 40 years of your life will be the same 40 years every day with the same habits, the same routines, the same speeches.
Right.
And so entrepreneurship meant as the capability to reinvent yourself and to remodel yourself, which is both for psychic systems, let's say individuals to be brief, and social systems. You are much younger than me, you are a great guy, but I am old enough to remember when there was the USSR. And believe me, in 1983, nobody would have thought that 60 years later, USSR would have disappeared. In the course of political science, when I was a student in Bologna, it was so funny. More or less the same years, a colleague of mine wrote a paper about how democracy is emerging in China, and he delivered his paper on Thursday, just guessing, and the professor came back on Monday with the corrected papers. And they told him, please write it again, because my colleague was so unfortunate that between Thursday, when he delivered the paper, and Monday, when the paper came back corrected, there had been Tiananmen Square in the middle. So in 4 days, the whole perception of the Chinese democracy changed in all the media and all the diplomatic institutions of the planet.
Yeah.
And my colleague wrote a great paper about why China is becoming much more democratic. So in 4 days, I wish my English is understandable enough.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you. The fourth and last dimension of hyper-citizenship is about social autonomy. Social autonomy is the same of the entrepreneurial version, citizenship, but in this case it is not focused on business, but is much more focused on the capability to network socially, to create your own not-for-profit network, for example, which doesn't give you directly an economical outcome, but provides you social capital, social network, legitimation, and all of what's around the possibility to reshape yourself and your context, both at a micro and macro level.
Mm-hmm. Well, I did have one question. In terms of sort of the strategic approach that we use, I guess what is the complex system approach? Like, what is the added value that this strategic approach brings?
Sure. In terms of complexity of the planet we live in social, economical, political terms, the complex system approach is able to show how powerful and how chaotic and how fluid the shapes of social change, political change, economical change, and legal change are. Normally, other approaches are much more still, static, rigid, if you prefer. And for example, they concept identity as something very much structured. There is a nice book from the 90s, where there are two nice books by an ethologist, which is a scholar who studies human behavior from the animal side. One book was about men at risk, and the other book was about the concept of war, WAR, no? And in men at risk, the key idea was that basically we are designing bridges, great buildings, great technologies, but our central nervous system is the same as it were in the Paleolithic age. Our neocortex, the most advanced part of our brain, evolved, but it wasn't so for our nervous system. So in practice, he says we are like apes driving an air jet.
Yeah.
Cognitively, we are much more than apes, but emotionally we still are apes. Yeah. And if you think about political campaigns, you can easily see the apes we are when we follow emotions and politics.
Yeah.
The other book was about war and how war in our species comes out when identity becomes rigid. And the rigidity of identity is a misleading effect of our Paleolithic central nervous system, because it is a kind of, how can I say, the nervous system compared to the brain is much more a photo camera, while our brain is much more a video camera and is
Yeah.
much faster to put together, to reconfigure, to recombine different symbols, different situations very quickly. Mm?
Yeah.
And so it is what happens when we use the concept of jurisdiction. The apes we are consider jurisdiction as something eternal. Rigidity of identity is a typical example of some misleading effects of our central nervous system, which is not able to tolerate too much variety in speed and change.
Hmm. Hmm.
Hmm? Nevertheless, the social systems changes beyond you. I give you an example. I was born in 67. Yes, I am an old guy. Okay? Hmm? I was born in 67 in Italy. When I was a kid, living in Italy it was easy because you were in a NATO country. The Western capitalists were the good, the Eastern communists were the evil. It was that simple. And in a certain way, it worked for a couple of decades, more or less, since I was born, which is a lot historically. Now, time is going faster, changes faster. Imagine a person of my same age born in Moscow. He or she went to grammar school learning how to write Marx as the first word. The second word to learn to write was Karl. And I'm joking, of course, but you understand the point. Can you hear me? Ryan, can you hear me?
Yes. Hello.
Hello, can you hear me? So I was saying,
Yeah.
a person of my same age in Russia, in Moscow, in the USSR, began his or her grammar school learning how to write Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels,
Right.
the first words to learn.
Yeah.
Then yeah, then up to the high school, they studied history from a Marxist-Leninist point of view, philosophy from a Marxist-Leninist point of view.
Sure.
Mm. They studied every discipline, including physics, from a Marxist-Leninist point of view.
Okay.
Then they went to the university. Mm. They got their degree according to a Leninist Marxist vision. And as soon as they got the degree, the government told them, we were joking. Now we are in a free market. Okay?
Yeah.
You can be communist, you can be capitalist. I don't talk about the political side of the topic. Imagine the kind of brain and nervous shock of such a change.
Right.
Things are Can you hear me?
Yes, there we go. I don't know what happened there.
Okay, but now can you hear me? Okay.
Yes. Last thing you were talking about, the last thing you said basically was you get to the university and then like, okay, now we're free market. So just kidding
Yeah.
about the Karl Marx stuff.
You can think left wing, you can think right wing. I don't care about the political side. I'm not giving a political conference.
Mm-hmm.
But imagine from the brain, from the central nervous system, how shocking it could be for a person who grew up 22 years of his or her life in a certain way, and the day after, all in a sudden, they told him or her, okay, in the last 22 years, we were joking, but this guy is 22. No? So he doesn't have a memory of another different scenario.
Yeah.
All his life till that moment was like that. It was a Marxist Leninist construction of his meaningful universe.
Yeah.
From that point, from that moment on, his model, right or wrong, I don't care about it, was totally denied by the system itself. So noise became meaning, and meaning became noise. And normally, our nervous system, our Paleolithic animal inside us, if we are not strongly cosmopolitan, if we are not strongly entrepreneurial, if we are not strongly scientifically intensive and informed, collapses. Because we were stuck in a very rigid idea of identity. That is why a complex system approach provides you those agility, fluidity, and capability to reframe change at an increasing speed.
Absolutely.
So, especially for policy modeling, for example, a key concept, it is the very last concept of this presentation, of my presentation, is jurisdiction. Jurisdiction is both legal and cultural. Some parts of the old USSR are now in the Russian Confederation. Some others became independent states with some little troubles, like Ukraine, with the Crimea problem with Russia, you know,
Yeah.
gas, oil, and whatever. And some other parts of the old USSR are nowadays European Union, like some Balkan republics, like Lithuania, I don't know how you pronounce in English, sorry, Estonia, and so forth. So it changed both the legal jurisdiction from the USSR to the European Union in the case of Estonia, for example, but at the same time, it also changed the matter of identity evolution, because your symbolic neighbors changed. For a guy from Estonia, now Vienna is much closer than Moscow, so to speak. Berlin is closer than Moscow. And so the making of identity is something that is very important in policy modeling. In a way, it can give an example of how we normally think in terms of stuck categories, while we need the complexity and fluidity to understand how the world around us can be remodeled, redesigned, and evolves. Sorry. That is why jurisdiction is very important, because jurisdiction is both legal and symbolic.
Right.
For example, there is a guy who is threatening the world to put new tariffs, more customs, and whatever, who forgot that since 1995, the only organ which is authorized to provide tariffs and customs in public debate is the WTO.
Hmm.
So before a state generates new tariffs towards another state, the round table to discuss it is the WTO central office, the headquarters. Or, as you could see in the recent changes now, the OECD became the leader, mostly one of the most maybe transnational, supranational organizations of our times. The OECD created a kind of directive in which it shaped, for better and for worse, for example, what tax avoidance means, what illicit financial flow means. And it is not upon the single jurisdiction of the states to decide what it is. It is on the OECD standards that we agree on that. In the health public policy modeling, the problem was more serious because in that case, the state jurisdiction was stronger than in other fields. And so what happened with the COVID? It happened that the World Health Organization was involved as a kind of consultant of the national state governments. But the WHO was not a decision maker, while the OECD was a decision maker about tariffs, about tax avoidance. And WTO, in a certain way, is a decision maker about tariffs, while WHO was not a decision maker about COVID strategy, COVID fight strategy. The WHO was a kind of scientific technical consultant of the national state government. And every state conceptualized, classified, and measured the contagion, the sickness, and the deaths in different ways. So nowadays, it's hard to, I mean, it can sound hard, but it's important to understand that in practice, we have no real, reliable data about COVID pandemic. There is a joke about, but it is a joke, so I want to be clear, it is a joke, okay? But the joke is very clear about the different approach of national states.
Okay.
Okay. There is a man aged 97
All right.
who dies in Germany. And at that moment, he had also the beginning of some COVID flu. But the man was 97, came from 3 heart attacks,
Yeah.
had the cancer surgery when he was 67.
Yeah.
Had an artificial left leg, for example. And the Germans are serious enough, now it's a joke, but you understand what I mean,
Sure.
to say this guy died because he was old.
Yeah.
A man in Italy of 97, 3 heart attacks, cancer, surgery, whatever, and some beginning of COVID flu.
Yeah.
This guy, in the certificate of the doctor, is dead for COVID.
Right.
It generated 2 different troubles. It generated, beyond the joke, a methodological problem in the construction of knowledge.
Yes.
So a lack of reliable data. And on the other side, in the social political economical fight among different actors, it became a tool to say, okay, don't go to Italy because then if you go there, you certainly get COVID.
Mm-hmm.
But it was some way also our fault because we were the ones who adopted that standard.
Yeah.
To classify, to conceptualize the concept of a person death of or with COVID.
Yeah.
If the WHO would not have been jurisdictionally just a consultant, but the decision maker, for better and for worse, we would have just one standard globally to define contagion, sickness, and death. The standard could even be arbitrary and not so much reliable, but would have created a very easy homogeneity of comparable data.
Could you repeat that last phrase? A what of comparable data?
Comparative, comparable, and more homogeneous data.
Homogeneous data, yeah. Absolutely.
You live in the USA, if I remember well. You live in Atlanta, Georgia.
Indeed.
Okay. So you are American, and you know that there is the meter and there is the yard.
Right.
There is the kilogram and there is the pound.
Indeed.
Okay. It's a very stupid matter. There is the kilometer and there is the mile. One more stupid matter. Because they are both false and they are both true. They are not ontologically true. They are just conventional measures.
Yeah.
Okay. In Italy, I am more or less metro 83, 1 meter and 83 centimeters. Maybe in your country it would be 6 feet and 1 or something like that.
Yeah.
6 feet. I never measured my feet. And why should be a feet 32 centimeters? There are small feet and big feet.
Yeah.
Okay. So, cutting it short, meters and yards, kilograms and pounds are not true, are conventional.
Sure.
And they work because they are conventional. In a certain way, you can convert meters into yards and vice versa.
Yeah.
But if you had only meters or only yards, it would be even easier.
Absolutely.
Okay. As both of them are not true, are just conventional, why are we multiplying the standards? So if we agree that a person of 97 with 3 cancer operations, 3 heart attacks, 97 years old, and the beginning of COVID flu is dying because of that, of his age, this person with that features will be dead for age everywhere.
Right.
And statistics would have been comparable.
Yeah.
At the moment, it is fantastic, and it is why complex systems are so important as an approach, because they show you how the construction depends on some criteria in the link between meaning and noise, knowledge and information, as I told you. And in practice, we are overwhelmed by data about contagion, about sickness, and about death, which mean absolutely nothing, which are just noise, because of the lack of the conventional standards in the homogenization of the conceptual string to come from the concept to the operational definition through the indexicals to the final variable. That is why jurisdiction is once again jurisdiction of legal shape, jurisdiction of identity, the broadest meaning of the word, and jurisdiction of knowledge. And these three are linked because in the case of OECD, its jurisdictional power is stronger than about tax avoidance or financial flows, illicit financial flows, than the power of WHO.
Aye.
In providing standards to us to conceptualize, describe, and assess the pandemia. That is why I think jurisdiction is so important to understand how movable are the borders, the symbolic borders of the planet we are living in. And probably a complex system approach to public policy modeling would be strategic also to have a more flexible, more cosmopolitan, more knowledge intensive, and more entrepreneurial and more socially active, proactive citizens.
Absolutely. Are these jurisdictions kind of changing in the current landscape in any interesting ways, or?
Yeah, there are many changes also, and some changes are also reason of great struggles in the media also. Maybe you don't have this perception across the ocean. The European Union has a certain number of powers which dramatically increased from the Treaty of Maastricht at the beginning of the 90s. So the single member states have some powers, but also the Union has some powers. And the strongest power of the Union is probably in the organ named European Commission. While the round table, where the member states still talk and debate, is the Council of the European Union Ministries of the member states. There is a round table with all the prime ministers, there is a round table for all the foreign ministers, there is a round table of the financial ministers, and so forth. So the soul of the European Union is twofold. On one side, it is still intergovernmental or international, but on the other side, it is much more supranational. So sovereignty is moving up. And many people in the public opinion of many weaker states, weaker economically and socially, I mean, still have the perception that the European Union is just the sum of the wills of the member states, while a system is much more than the sum of its parts. OECD, as I told you before, was another example about the financial the definition of illicit financial flows, or the definition of tax avoidance. The final decision maker was the OECD, not the single state. And it was fun because a couple of days ago, I read an article in the Italian newspapers, but I think you can find it on Google also in English. And it was about Putin is going to punish the fiscal havens, the tax havens like Malta, Cyprus, the Netherlands, because he wants his money back. Too many capitals from Russia moved to
Offshore accounts.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. So if you read that article, your impression is the great influence and power of Mr. Putin on some European Union countries who can tell Mr. Putin who cares, and they say Who cares? Because I am a gentleman. Hmm?
Mm-hmm.
If you consider that a ruble, sorry, €1 is about 87, 88 rubles. So in practice, with the price of 3 dinars here, I buy a limousine in Moscow. I'm joking, but you understand the concept. Hmm? And that the gross domestic product of the Russian Confederation is smaller than the Italian GDP. And the Italian GDP is just 1/7 of the European Union GDP. You can imagine that the Russian GDP is about 1/9 of the European Union GDP. Moreover, 88 rubles to have €1. So, what is your influence, your power and influence as Russia on the Union now? It's nothing. Nevertheless, Putin could do that because he could do that measure against Malta, Cyprus, and the tax havens because of a general agreement of OECD and G20, also signed by the European Union. So it was something coming from up to down, top down. It was the G20 with the OECD, including the European Union, who made the general agreement.
Yeah.
And these standards are valid all over the planet.
Mm-hmm.
That is why Putin could implement it. It was not the Russian power to fight against the tax havens. Because in that case, the answer would have been, who cares? So that is why it is important to focus on jurisdiction. In that case, the jurisdiction was G20 and the OECD.
Yeah.
But the perception in the media could be a kind of a strange influence of Russia on the European Union.
Right on.
I wish this example is clear enough to make sense of this long and I wish not too boring presentation.
It is. I'm with you. I understand.
Okay, so I think if you don't have further questions, I think we can stop here.
Aye.
And I think I have to thank you for your great support and professional help and understanding and patience.
Dr. PItasi, thank you so much. That was fantastic. If you guys are interested in learning more, WCSAglobal.org. That's WCSAglobal.org. I'm Ryan Gautreaux, Georgia State University. It's been fun. I'll see you next time.